arms. They put a law in place that folks of color, Black people, could not buy arms. Then came the War of 1812, and Andrew Jackson is the leader, the military leader, and he sees the British coming in this Battle of New Orleans. And he sees this Black militia, and he's telling Claiborne, we need them. This is an effective fighting force. And Claiborne's like, yes, they are, but I'm telling you, they're just not feeling it right now because of the way we treat them. And he's like, I will treat them equally. I will treat them with the honor that all soldiers should have, and they will be paid equal to whites. They will receive the same pay. And besides the Black militia, I want 2 additional battalions. Claiborne came back and said, you can get the Black militia, but getting 2 additional battalions is going to be difficult because whites in this area believe that arming them is arming the enemy. So you have Black folks who are identified as the enemy. And in that fighting force, that force beat the British. It was like 3,000 or so of Andrew Jackson's troops against 8,000 British troops, and they won. And Andrew Jackson was like, wow, I knew you guys were good. I just didn't know how good. But the response, the reaction to that then was to send them off as a labor battalion to work in the swamps that white men didn't want to go into to do the work. So you have this denigration of Black military contributions to fighting for America. And that was a consistent theme that we saw. So you get this erasure of this history, and this erasure for the men themselves who are doing the fighting, who are being wounded, who are dealing with the loss of their fighting brethren. That has been the sense that Black men under arms, they're a threat. And Black men who are trained how to use arms, they're really a threat. So they must be disarmed after they have served our purpose.
Professor Anderson, I just wanted to follow up on the term you used, anti-Blackness, that you're actually saying that the Second Amendment is not about guns, but it's about anti-Blackness. Explain.
Yes, it is about the fear. So, and the best way to do this is to talk about the kind of history that we have about the Second Amendment. We hear the history of the militia about being this really effective fighting force to fend off a foreign invasion and also being there to fend off domestic tyranny. But what they knew at the time was that the militia had proven to be uneven, unreliable in the War of Independence, the War for Independence. George Washington was beside himself at the lack of reliability of the militias. Sometimes they would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would just take off and run away. It's really difficult to form a battle plan when your fighting force is like, I'm not feeling it today. And it led Gouverneur Morris, who is out of New York and one of the founding fathers, to say to rely upon the militia against a foreign invasion is like to depend upon a broken reed. And so they knew that the militia was really not strong against a professional army. And then there was Shays' Rebellion. What they saw with Shays' Rebellion is that you could not really rely upon the militia in order to deal with an uprising and insurrections against government. You could not rely upon them for that. Where the militia was consistently good was in slave revolts, in crushing slave revolts. And so this is what led George Mason and Patrick Henry to talk about, we must control our militia. We will be left defenseless against its slave revolts if the federal government controls it. And so it is that fear of slave revolts, that fear of Black rebellion, this fear of Blacks as a dangerous population that must be controlled by these militias that was essential in the drafting of the Second Amendment. When you think about the Bill of Rights, how you've got the right to freedom of the press, how you have no state-sponsored religion, how you have freedom of assembly, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment. And so you see these incredible rights, and then you've got this well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms for the security of the state. That amendment is an outlier in this Bill of Rights. And that outlier is because it was the payoff to the South to have a force under state control that could contain Black aspirations, Black freedom quests, that could contain what is seen as a dangerous Black population.
So, Professor Anderson, another issue that you raise in the book as absolutely critical has to do with the denial of the rights of citizenship to Blacks. So if you could explain the crucial Supreme Court decision here, Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, and how even after the 14th Amendment was passed, Dred Scott continued to take precedence.
Yes, and so the Dred Scott decision was designed to try to stop the explosion that was happening, the secessionist crisis that was happening in the United States, because there had been a series of events, the Missouri Compromise, the war for Texas, the Kansas and Bleeding Kansas. All of these things were about the expansion of slavery and the fight to contract slavery. And so the Dred Scott decision, so Dred Scott was a Black man who was enslaved. And his owner had taken him to free soil states, Wisconsin and to Illinois. And then he was taken to Missouri, which was a slave state. He had argued that because he had been on free soil for years, that he was free. What this decision said, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, was that Black people were never considered citizens of the United States. They weren't considered citizens at the founding with the Constitution. They weren't considered citizens, and that there's with the Uniform Militia Act of 1792, they weren't considered citizens when the Secretary of State refused to issue Black people passports, saying they're not citizens. They're denied the ability to carry the mail. All of these things prove that they're not citizens. He said in this decision, if they were citizens, they would be able to go easily from state to state. But there were laws that prevented that. And he said, and they would be able to carry arms wherever they went. And so in there, you see that being able to carry arms is a sign of citizenship in this framing. And it's saying they're not citizens. Dred Scott was the one that said that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Dred Scott, in fact, did not stop the crisis. In fact, it added to it, and it helped lead to the Civil War. After the Civil War, you had Andrew Johnson as the president of the United States, basically issuing these mass amnesties to the Confederacy, to Confederate leaders, who then reassumed their positions in these states. And they passed constitutions and laws that denied Black people their rights. One of the laws that they passed were the Black Codes. The Black Codes, among other things, besides trying to control labor, the Black Code said that Black people could not bear arms. They could not have weapons, and that they needed to be disarmed. You had the rise of these paramilitary groups working in league with these neo-Confederate states, trying to disarm Black people. You had a bloody massacre, one right after the next. There's a travelogue of carnage by Carl Schurz, who writes on the report of the conditions in the South that is just harrowing. Historian and legal scholar Annette Gordon-Reed calls it a slow motion genocide. And you have Black troops, Black Union troops, U.S. troops, who are part of the occupying army in the South. You have white Southerners absolutely outraged that you would have Black soldiers as an occupying force in what they see as their space. And so they begin to talk about the violence that we're seeing. The violence that is happening is because these Black soldiers are here. If these Black soldiers weren't here, then this killing wouldn't be happening. And so Andrew Johnson removes the Black soldiers. First, he removes them from the interior of the South and puts them on coastal fortifications, and then shortly thereafter removes them as an occupying force in the South altogether. Those Black soldiers saw themselves as a line of defense protecting the newly freed people from the terror that was raining down on them. So the denigration of Black soldiers, the attempt to disarm Black people after the war, the language that Black people aren't really citizens, that Black people are dangerous and they cannot have access to weapons because it challenges the safety and the security of white Southerners. I mean, that's what was going on at this time.
Professor Anderson, I wanted to leap forward to ask about how authorities responded to the Black Panthers, which urged Black people to arm themselves in the 60s. This is Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panther Self-Defense Party, speaking in 1967.
The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense calls upon the American people in general and the black people in particular to take full note of the racist California legislature, which is now considering legislation aimed at keeping the black people disarmed and powerless at the very same time that racist police agencies throughout the country are intensifying the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people.
So if you could respond to this, Carol Anderson, to respond to Bobby Seale.
Yeah, so what Bobby Seale is talking about is the depth of the police violence and brutality that was raining down on the Black community. The uprisings that we saw in Watts, in Cleveland, in Newark, in Detroit, were all fueled not only by those horrific conditions in those places, but also by police brutality. And the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded as a response to the brutality of the Oakland Police Department. And so what the Black Panthers did, they said, we will police the police. They knew what the law said about open carry in California. And they also knew what the law said about the distance that you had to maintain from a police officer arresting someone. So the Black Panthers would come to those arrests fully armed with the kinds of legal weapons that they were allowed to have. And the police did not like it. They did not like it. And so the Oakland Police Department went to Don Mulford, an assemblyman, a California assemblyman, and said, we need your help. We need to make what the Black Panthers are doing illegal, because currently it's legal. We stop them, but they've got the right kinds of weapons. We can't arrest them for what they're doing. We need to be able to make their work illegal. And so what Mulford did with the help of the NRA was to write the Mulford Act, which banned open carry, which was a gun control act. And it was a gun control act targeted at the Black Panthers. So Mulford said, no, there's no racial targeting in this at all. This is about the Klan as well. But it wasn't. The letters make it really clear that the genesis for this, the catalyst for it, was how do we curtail the Black Panthers? How do we make them illegal?
Fascinatingly, moving forward 20 years, I want to go to former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger, 1991, appearing on the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
If I were writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, that people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime.
This has been the greatest fraud. We're going to have to end with this final comment of yours, Professor Anderson.
Yes, and that fraud has been that swaddling of the Second Amendment in the flag, in patriotism, in a sense of that the militia were there to protect and defend democracy, when in fact the militia were there designed to control Black people and deny Black people their rights. So in the Second Amendment, what we have in the Bill of Rights is the right to destroy Black people's rights. That is anathema. That is what has been committed.
What most shocked you in your research?
How consistent this anti-Blackness was and how it carries through to today with stand your ground laws, how it carries through with the ways that Black people are seen as threats, as monsters, as dangerous, simply because of their very being, and that puts a crosshairs on them. That is, writing this book was hard. Because writing about the past and carrying it to the future in the midst of the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, was just, in the midst of the pandemic, was just a lot.